I'm Kevin Mims with the Invading Sea, a Florida-wide media collaborative that reports on climate change in the state. As part of that effort, we've started The Business of Climate Change, a weekly interview with businessmen and women whose companies are either affected by the warming climate or address climate challenges. Today's conversation is with Jeff Huber, Principal and Director of Planning, Landscape Architecture, and Urban Design at Brooks Scarpa, and Director of the Florida Atlantic University School of Architecture. Jeff, thanks for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me, Kevin.
So, Jeff, as a native Floridian as well as an architect and landscape architect, what are the kind of changes you've seen in South Florida with regard to climate change?
Wow, that's a big question right from the get-go. But I think it starts out. I mean, as you just indicated, I was born and raised in South Florida. You used to be able to set a clock at 3 p.m. every summer afternoon to those storms that would just be coming in from the Everglades and coming back as that oscillation would happen. I mean, the interesting thing is too, in 1992, I actually lived in Homestead. Wind event we all know well, Hurricane Andrew. And these were, kind of normal things to me. But as I gotten older, that Hurricane Andrew was actually a fundamental point in my life where it's actually what got me interested in architecture, quite frankly. And to see from one morning to the next, just complete and utter devastation. It was kind of a shock of what Mother Nature could do, right? And now we are in this 30 years later, near 30 years later, actually, this next year from that event. And over those, I've seen some pretty interesting changes. I always say I was exiled in Arkansas for about a decade of time between this. And so it was interesting when I came back after those 10 years, the changes that I did see, because I equate that to, kind of the frog. I mean, everybody uses analogies, and this analogy is always, one of my favorite ones, because the analogy of if you throw a frog in boiling water, they're going to jump out, right? They realize something is wrong. And then there's the put the frog in a pot of cold water and turn it on high, that frog will end up boiling, right? This is a shock or a challenge. We always we're living it from day to day. And so that interesting gap where I would had a clear kind of transition. I love the Everglades. I love the Everglades, Kevin. And this is like the first thing I noticed when I moved back was driving to the Everglades and going down to Flamingo to the national park there from Homestead. It was my backyard growing up, so it was what I wanted to always be at, and so I made sure that. And this radical change of like, why are there more mangroves further inland now? I remember seeing that and like, this wasn't like this when I was even a kid, and even when I remembered it that last time. But that transition was all of a sudden really baked into my memory. And I can say that was some of this first. And this was like the first week I was back. Second week I was back, we had one of these 100-year storm events, which I always hate the name 100-year storm event, because it's not that it happens once in 100 years, it's that it has a 1% chance of happening in any given year. But we're seeing these happen much more frequently, and we have one of those. I was never flooding. I mean, in homes grew up, we would see flooding like that on very few years. But we had three of those events in my first year back. So things clearly were not in a kind of normal situation. I mean, well, it was just a little out of whack. But since this was 2014, but since I've been back in 2014 to the area, I've noticed a lot. The fact that Las Olas Boulevard, let me tell you, engineers don't design streets to flood. They design them to drain and drain properly. When you see a street flooding because of king tide events, because it's just the infrastructure working in reverse, that's not normal. That would not have been designed. So you are seeing things clearly as evidence, just from an anecdotal perspective, the observation of it, that we are seeing a climate disruption of some sort. We are seeing that we are living in this kind of Anthropocene now. That we, as a human species, are obviously creating some of these changes. But South Florida in particular is unique because it is the canary in the coal mine. We are seeing global changes happening at a local level. And so, everybody that I'm sure you talk to in this production, I mean, we talk about the heat, it's getting hot, it's getting wet, it's also getting salty. It's getting saltier because of the saltwater intrusion. We're seeing well fields that I know were in use as a kid are now being shut down. We just all of these kind of observations, and I'm not even talking about the scientific data that would qualify these things too. And so all of these challenges are pointing to that. Sure, there's rising seas, but there's this other data sets that there's a changing pattern of our weather. We are now getting more frequent or less frequent rainstorms, but we're getting more rain in those less storms. So we are getting, what some call rain bombs, some call, the 100-year storm events. We're getting those much more frequently now. And so our challenges are becoming much, much more impacted. And that's an interesting conundrum that you clearly see through this evidence. And just my the fact that I've lived my whole life here, I can at least, kind of have that, but that gap of that 10 years was just fundamental, at least in re-educating myself, that when you live in a place your whole life, you may not see those changes, or you may not rationalize that flooding from salt water versus flooding from fresh water is different. And I love the Eskimos because they got like 100 words for snow, but we only kind of call flooding one thing. And I think we need to start thinking about it in a few different ways, because we do flood in different ways. And I love John Englander because he's kind of categorized it around 5 different forms of flooding. And I've kind of pulled those in, and we can talk more about those, but those 5 forms of flooding are very different and are changing and oscillating around based on this climate disruption and climate change that we're seeing.
Jeff, how have climate change and sea level rise influenced architectural designs in Florida? And what are some of the main challenges designers are facing?
Another great question. I mean, I know personally, a lot of my research when I came here, just being from here, was I wanted to figure out how do we adapt to sea level rise? Is it actually happening? So the first thing I did was I hit the ground with many of the folks I know that have been, on your show, but also have been, interviewed and have been in part of the Invading Sea. These are trying times. And as a landscape architect and as an architect, I'm kind of coming from it from a very unique perspective. And I just recently became a landscape architect, but if you could ask anybody, it's like I've always been one. I've had this fascination with how do we think about coupling architectural and landscape architectural ideas. And so fundamentally, it is changing the way architects and designers think about the built environment in a multitude of ways. But in my way, I see urbanism as the missing link that we aren't quite talking about, but I see it as the one thing in which is a common numerator or denominator, if you will, because it's urbanism that gives the architectural profession, the landscape architectural profession, the planning profession, a holistic framework, through which complex systems can be engaged. And even though those the missing piece in our discussions about resilience and adaptation, ironically, because we talk about buildings, we talk about infrastructure, we talk about broader impacts of streets and roads, but it's that urbanism that really links all of those things together. And so for me, what we as a profession, as designers, as policymakers, really need to think about that urbanism types of frameworks to be challenges around the ways, the heat, all of these things are going to change the way in which we think about design in the built environment.
Jeff, how has climate related issues changed how architecture is taught? How is it different now that you're a professor compared to when you were a student?
That's it's interesting because I'm finding in the school I went to, we were trained very well. What I loved about the school I went to is I was trained in modernist thinking. So it was really an international style. Although, the Sarasota School of Architecture was a premier kind of impact on my program. Paul Rudolph, Ralph Twitchell, the Gene Lee, these folks that were amazing architects because they were designing architecture in the Florida environment, predating air conditioning, how to think about that. But I also have the amazing ability of learning from the lineage of H.T. Odom, which was a prominent ecologist in the state of Florida, taught through University of Florida, and Charles Kibbert, who unfortunately just passed away recently, but he was one of my professors at University of Florida that taught a course on ecology, taught a course on green building practices, and these were all within their infancy. And then, I also had another professor that taught materials and methods of subtropical sustainability, Alfred Browning Parker, a prominent architect in the 50s, 60s, 70s through Miami. These were amazing folks that laid the groundwork in my education, but the education has in fact changed. I mean, that's been 30 years, 20 years ago. The education now, we know a lot more. These were just, and what I would say is that it was based on passive design practices when I went through school. So the idea of cross ventilation, the idea of orientation, the idea of broad overhangs, the idea of maximizing the way in which you use breeze blocks to harvest breezes, all of those things, the kind of free work that architecture could do for you. So what's interesting now is we are in this oscillation that we haven't forgotten those things. I think those things are coming back heavier, and quite frankly, I think they need to be baked into our code. To have a building that cannot open a window in our environment is, to me, illegal and should, just an admission built on your part that you don't understand the world in which we live, right? And so I think our code will need to change to allow for that. I mean, you only have to look back to Hurricane Irma, and I can get into those kind of ideas, but the interesting thing coming back to this is that students now are having to learn modeling techniques. In our computation, our modeling programs have become interesting, and that they can really, like we had to do it in my time as a kind of it's like your grandparents kind of just knew things, right? We had basic ideas of models, and we just knew that they worked. It was like rules, right? It was like, it was like drinking out of a glass, right? You learn it once, you riding a bike, now there's so many programs that allow for you as a new tool to expand on those rules that we had, but then to prove that your concepts, your ideas, your designs are going to work. So you can stick your model, your 3D computer model now into a program, and it will do a solar radiation study for you. It will determine if the wind and how the wind will react on your building. It will determine how water and flooding would react on your building. So I think those capacities have given us just more tools that allay those and build upon the foundations in our programs. And so to me, it's really exciting, but I think I do want to just caution that students really need to understand the history, the epistemology of how all of this has kind of transpired, and leveraging those tools, but adding them into knowing, what my business partner would say is it's just common Jewish sense. It was like these practices that we all knew. It's just, it's like it's a no-brainer, as we would call it. So, the education has really changed in our School of Architecture at Florida Atlantic University, has really restructured itself around community engagement, community design, and thinking about resiliency and adaptation specifically for these reasons, but within a region that is in a subtropical environment. And just to kind of put this as a case in point, our school is uniquely positioned because we are in a downtown environment. We're one of the only schools of architecture in a downtown. We're not on the campus. Our main part accredited program is in the downtown Fort Lauderdale campus. So it gives us that unique perspective where we're working with community stakeholders, we're working with community governmental agencies, and we're working through some of these issues. So some of the interesting aspects that my students now have much better access than I had, where I was learning from books, they're actually getting real world experience going out into those streets. We were just talking about flooding, and being able to say, how do we begin to think about these things and doing designs that then the city go out that has no skin in the game one way or the other. We're not the property owner, and we're not the party having to solve taxpayer monies. We're the ones trying to just say, here is what we can show you as the best solution to put forward. And to me is what's exciting in students' education today.
Jeff, so have building codes sufficiently kept up with our changing weather and rising sea levels?
Well, yes and no. I think if we look back to that wind event, Hurricane Andrew, I think we've become very resilient and durable to wind. That is without a doubt definite. And so we're able to survive that 4, 5 hour, 6 hour wind event. What we're not prepared for well in our code right now is the event that happens after it. And that's what I was mentioning about Hurricane Irma. You only have to look at Hollywood, the unfortunate events that happened there in the assisted living facility. And, and to sit there and say, that should not happen in a modern society. It should not happen in a society that, prides itself on its ability, especially to create more, to protect life and property, which, that's the life, safety, and welfare of property and life is what we do as architects, landscape architects, and any designer of the built environment. We haven't done well, to the life, especially in thinking about how we survive wind events, the aftermath. I remember after Hurricane Andrew, I lived 4 weeks without power. It was a long time. It was probably even longer. That's just when we got the generator after they were all bought from the stores, right? And we were able to get some AC back. It was pretty hot that time around. But even after Hurricane Irma, I remember, my wife and kids, we all left because I didn't want to live through the I've seen them, been there, done that, didn't want to do it again. We came back prematurely and still had 8 days without power. I remember our ability, and I personally bought a home that was predating air conditioning for this exact reason. I was at least able to open up the doors. I was not cold, but I was comfortable. Okay, we could live comfortably. We didn't have carpet, we had terrazzo flooring, we had these kind of things. And I guess my point is to this is that code really needs to identify this kind of passive design strategies to really, I mean, this is, if you hire the right architect, you're going to get this free of charge, right? There's no doubt in my mind. Smart architects are smart architects, no matter what. We don't need a code to really tell us to do the right thing. We just do it. It's kind of, like sustainability in general. I hate talking about sustainability, green architecture, resiliency, adaptation, because quite frankly, it's just what it's the business we do, right? You hire us as experts to do those things. But it's the challenges is when you see that only 10% of the built environment is actually designed by architects, right? Other 90% is not architecturally designed, or it's not architect led. It's X, Y, and Z. I'm not going to get into the schema, the splitting hairs of it, but with that statistic, you can see that becomes the challenge. So what we need to do is have some base minimums in the code that allow for that survivability after those events. And that's going to do a bellwether of change for us to just allow for affordable housing. When we think about that, affordability, it's a kind of oxymoron. We're trying to build affordable housing to make it, one, affordable to build, but we're putting folks into it. And when we put them into housing that they can't actually pay for the electric bill, because one, we didn't put enough insulation in it. Two, we didn't put an insulated window or a higher grade when we could have paid that money up front to save that individual $50 a month in their electric bill. I mean, those are the challenges. And so I think, to me, our code can be written around some of these other things, but also the code around flooding. FEMA is doing a great job. They're starting to try to get sea level rise kind of baked into it. We're Broward County in particular is mapping the groundwater tables, trying to figure out, different things about future conditions. I think all of those things are tremendous, and they're only going to help us understand the context of the place that we're living. And that's where I was going to say. So it's the building, but it's also the everything else, the horizontal and the vertical infrastructure that really need to be considered. And so I just see too the ability for pilot mainstream nature and nature-based features as infrastructure. I think one of the things that we need to learn is that landscape is no longer ornament or decoration in our built environments. It must become part of the infrastructure, i.e. a tree means several things. It's a pump. It's a shade device. Is it's a hyper accumulator of air filter, right? And so when we talk about health and wellness in our built environment, water and especially, right, we're all talking now about air quality more so than we ever have before. So all of these things are various challenges. I think the code can do better to go up to. And it's not to say that it's bad. I think there's energy. It's clearly a big issue with energy. Adapt. I mean, the fact is that we need to think about the buildings. We need to develop areas that allow for more flexibility, i.e., maybe ideas. These are ideas that have been talked about for years. I love Duani, the Congress for the New Urbanism, CNU, that talked a lot about the red tape. So let's make pink districts. These ideas have areas where you can test things. They become incubators. So we can, we have a little more leverage where if it didn't work, okay, we figured it out. It didn't work. Move on, right? Because I think right now we have it's either this or that. It's black or white. We need that gray. We need testing grounds. We need to try to figure things out because we know sea level rise, for instance, anything we put in the ground at least live a lifespan of 60 years. And why do I say that? It's because we need to look that 60 years out. And that's for twofold. Like when you're looking at a house, inflation rates every 30 years. So that's two cycles of a mortgage, right? That is a cycle of one infrastructure because it takes about 10 years to plan, design, and then build that infrastructure. That's for 50 years. If we're not thinking about that point, then there's something fundamentally wrong and we're wasting taxpayer dollars. I mean, two, I think when we get into code, it gets into, there's two different things, right? We have the floor building and then we have the LDRs that we within the city and the county. Now, to think about density. I mean, I always find it entertaining because we say, well, how are we for these? And that if intensity, you would create a taxable land infrastructure around it. And right now, we are building mostly, or working most family homes. Evidence, all the about percent basics that support them. We're talking about. I'm sorry. I think I lost the internet.
Yeah, it looks like we dropped out there at the end of that.
You hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you want me to start again here, but I guess the one thing that I have come to understand, and it's something that I'm kind of toying with right now, and it just kind of ties to this conversation about code and what can we be doing, is we know things will need to change from a standpoint of how do we respond to rising seas? And there's only three fundamental strategies that I've seen. If anybody can come up with more, please tell me. But we're going to probably need to retreat from low vulnerable areas, right? There's just no a way around that. Or you have to raise the land, or you allow the land to inundate and flood, and you design around that. To me, that's a kind of creative aspect. But this code's got to allow for that, right? So those solutions will come with very different code, I think, around them and how you would reconcile that. And so right now we have one code that is like a rubber stamp that's trying to fit all. And if we can just kind of relax things, but also to broaden the way we think about it to allow for those folks that, hey, I think it would be really cool to live on with and over water. And maybe some days I got to boat to work rather than drive to work. Like that's kind of cool, right? That's like the way Amsterdam, or way the Netherlands would think about it. That's the way, potentially you have New Orleans that's going to have to think about it. We could have this kind of economic, environmental, and social capital that we really galvanize around that says we are absolutely unique and people will want to come and see this. How are we doing it? How are we thriving within this adversity? Because I see it as opportunity. I don't see this as, as a issue, a problem. I mean, we've bought into it. So let's accept it and let's move forward and let's figure out how to live with it, live on over with water. To me, that's exciting as a potential. And it also sets up, just like we have planning departments, why don't we have unplanning departments? And think about the idea of where do we move from? How do we strategically move to? How do we create these kind of densification, intensification, and then extensive, like, maybe things look different west of 95 than they look east of 95 because of the ridge versus the fact that when it was west. I always love Bobby Stroud, the former director of the South Florida Water Management District, always said, he loved it when it rained because anything west of 95, when it rains, it was once the Everglades, and when it rains, it remembers it, right? It's like the idea of that is just a kind of, it makes a lot of sense. It's like, well, that's why they flood a lot worse off than, say, some other areas, east of 95. And so it's really, you have to understand fundamentally what was under the ground before we developed it, too. And I think that's the other thing the code needs to somewhat think about is what was this once as an ecological system? What was that? I mean, obviously, if you're living next to a river, you've got to assume it's going to flood and flood frequently. If you're living on a higher ground, you're probably less likely to flood, but maybe you want to hold your water so you're not, flowing downhill and flooding your neighbor, right? And so those kind of, no brainer, those things we are kind of getting into the code, but I think we need a little bit more of that. And I think nature has the ability to be baked into some of that code thinking. I always love the statement that I think of, let us botanize the asphalt, right? How do we begin to think about landscape? Our road systems are way over engineered, and we can sit there, especially within small, more localized roads, keep our streets, make them much safer, but also make them flood resilient, make them flood adaptive. And that could be saltwater flooding, freshwater flooding. I think we need to think through those things, that it's not a one size fits all.
Got it. So, Jeff, how can our state and federal governments enable more climate friendly design practices?
Well, I think they can enable them by looking at those, especially working with universities, working with local leadership, and working with local architects, with local landscape architects, with local planners, engineers, to try things, to test things. I mean, I can't tell you how much, there is a level of there's a mismatch here. There is tremendous research that is being done in the higher education that is not being transferred into the public sector, into development, into those things. And to me, if there was some ability to tie some of these concepts and these thinking, allow for us, I mean, this goes back to, this would have to be state mandated. I mean, that's why they mandated adaptation action areas. These were areas in which gave us greater flexibility and leniency to kind of move funds around to do the things we needed to do. So some of that's going to have to be put in place, and I think too, it's interesting because the state is going to have to think about how do we produce energy, how do we deal with wastewater, how do we deal with food production in the future? Because I mean, quite frankly, when the seas come, it's we may not have an ability to feed ourselves, at that point. I mean, that's a broader issue. So I think we see things starting to happen hyper locally, but things need to be enabled at the state point, right? Right now, state law dictates that we cannot zone a activity in the city for agriculture. Like, really? Why? We can do urban ag. There are legislative, like Fort Lauderdale, for instance, has urban agriculture in their code, so you are entitled to do that by right. And so there's certain things that just need to happen, and that's where the state could really help from our standpoint. But I think too, creating those enabling legislation that one protects tax. I think it's incredible that they have the bill now, or the law, I should say, that allows for you to any public property that is developing and using taxpayer dollars must and it's on a coastal area, must actually have an assessment to find out its vulnerability to sea level rise before any money can be spent. I think that's smart. That's a good first step. But I think next steps are, that we have some design frameworks, implementation, and we allow for testing. I think the testing and a kind of incubator, these kind of areas where we can do case studies and pilot level projects, is the important next step. There's no way we're going to mainstream things, and there's no way a developer is ever going to say, I'm going to try something absolutely new that nobody's ever done unless somebody else has been the guinea pig before them. So if we can go ahead and use some public taxpayer dollars to support this, and use creative developers and use creative designers to make those things happen, to me, that would be a win. And that's something that the state can help facilitate for sure.
Jeff, thank you for your time. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.